I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, first and foremost, I would like to thank Mr. Ebo and Mr. Nixon for their substantive briefings. With astonishing tenacity, our Western colleagues every month convene meetings on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, hypocritically calling for a swift cessation of hostilities, which in their understanding is only possible with the de facto defeat of Russia. In fact, de facto, they're continuing to do the exact opposite. They're pumping Ukraine with different types of weapons, and they're dissuading the Kiev regime from realistic scenarios to regulate or settle the Ukrainian crisis. The volume of Western assistance to Ukraine is breaking all records. If we were to tackle this issue seriously, we could have our meetings every day, and nonetheless, every time, something new would have occurred. However, the proposals from our former Western partners there are no such proposals that would actually help to find a peaceful solution. We've not heard any in the previous meetings. Rather, all we get is baseless accusations and rhetoric against our country. However, those things that are uncomfortable for our former Western partners are carefully ignored or pushed under the rug. I therefore, in my statement, would like to touch on some topics that are uncomfortable for our Western colleagues. The cynicism of our former Western partners is astonishing today. Mr. Nixon quoted some of these, and I would like to quote the Dutch Defense Minister, Kees Ollerland, who on the 4th of October, and I quote, said that Ukraine was a cheap way of countering Russia. As Der Spiegel writes, Kiev has become the main importer of ammunition and hardware from Germany over the first 9 months of this year. Out of the whole of Germany's military export, more than a third went to Ukraine. That's $3.3 billion US. Furthermore, on the side of the Kiev regime, there are at least 13 foreign PMCs and 9 militarized proxy formations. So that's almost 1,000 well-armed and trained fighters from 35 countries. I'd underscore, Russia is countering not the Ukrainian army, whose resources are almost depleted, but the collective military machine of NATO countries and the military-industrial complex. It's got to the situation whereby, in trying to fuel Kiev's ambitions, many Western European countries have almost fully depleted their ammunition and light weapons, but the sponsors of the Kiev regime cannot be calmed down. Reserves are now being tapped into on the orders of the US. They're being supplied from Israel and South Korea, other areas. The military machine of the Kiev regime is collapsing, however, in front of our eyes. At the same time, where Zelensky, who's going to Western capitals, is continuing to beg for deliveries. Washington is stooping to different machinations just to deceive public opinion in the US and to push through Congress another package for Ukraine. The UK has provided Terrorhawk Paladins to Ukraine as part of its packet of assistance to the tune of £100 million. And 70 million of which are for anti-missile defense. Belgium has also, when Zelensky was there on a visit, allocated $1.7 billion. Incidentally, these resources are tax receipts and interest from the foreign Russian assets that have been frozen, but rather they've been stolen by the West. Germany announced an allocation to Ukraine of a packet to the tune of $1 billion, including IRIS-T SMLs. The head of the Pentagon, Mr. Austin, talked about the need to ensure regular, ongoing flows of weapons to Ukraine, and also talked about the establishment of a coalition of countries that would help Ukraine develop its own air force. There's also the threat of new supplies of F-16 aircraft by spring 2024, as if they were able to change anything. There's ongoing irresponsible statements about Ukraine joining NATO. And obviously this scenario would just worsen the European security crisis. We see the direct result of this with the actions in Ukraine. The Western sponsors of the Kiev regime are trying to play down the ever louder calls from civil society in different countries as to what is the situation with the rampant corruption in Ukraine, given these huge sums of weapons that are being allocated. However, it also seems rather that control for these arms supplies is very weak or just doesn't exist, and a result of this is deplorable. The supply amounts are absolutely astonishing. For example, just a few days ago, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said that weapons that had been supplied to Ukraine by the West were located on the border with Israel. The fact that that weapons that are from Ukraine are turning up in the Middle East, according to corrupt schemes, is something that on Monday the representative of the Kiev regime actually mentioned. He actually tried to pin the blame for that on Russia, but of course a guilty conscience gives itself away. By formally denying the statements by the Israeli military about these ammunition with marks of the Ukrainian army on them, the Ukrainian security forces, when there was mention made of Muchakevo, went to Muchakevo to do a search, and they conducted a series of arrests. No comment, as they say, with no surprise that if weapons from Ukraine were to turn up in other hotspots, there are calls for tender, and of course the Western producers in the US and the UK, their commands are skyrocketing. Nonetheless, the Western countries are using this situation in order to line their own pockets. Ukraine has once and for all become a testing ground for testing out new hardware and technology. Let's look at Ukraine. There are Leopards, and the US, according to the Asia Times, has decided not to send M1 Abrams tanks. Rather, they're going to use lighter and more compact vehicles. Unlike Ukraine, its Western backers are deriving direct gains from this conflict. It's just the Ukrainians who are missing out. They are the pawns in this geopolitical game. The Ukrainian army is encountering serious problems with filling their ranks. The mobilization call-up campaign is stalling. The Verkhovna Rada discussed a draft law on lifting the age limit for older soldiers. So in other words, Ukrainian servants of the people, as they call themselves, want to take the older people. So you've got to serve until you die, in other words. Kiev is increasingly hearing calls up for more young people. The former top advisor of the Kiev regime, Mr. Arestovich, who was mentioned already today, who now works on a new Ukrainian political project to ensure Zelensky's victory in any upcoming elections, and for some reason has a right to control people's minds, he recognized that it is hard to motivate a 45-year-old Ukrainian, but a 25-year-old is still fairly immature and prepared to be manipulated. So it's just the 25-year-olds, therefore, who are being used, and not the 45-year-olds. So, or is it that pensioners are becoming cannon fodder? And interestingly, Russian soldiers are increasingly seeing 60 to 70-year-old Ukrainian fighters surrender. However, those who set up this anti-Russian project on our friendly country of Ukraine just are not bothered by this whatsoever. Our Western colleagues are continuing to pump Ukraine with weapons and money, and they want to do this, have victory at any cost. However, the hard-earned cash could in fact be spent much better, for example, to invest in Russia for a double goal of developing its capacity to have good neighbourly relations and to ally with Russia, and to support measures that any normal civilized state would have, for example, in the context of protecting the rights of national minorities, or having an ultimate aim of actually implementing the Minsk agreements approved by the UN Security Council as the only way of settling the domestic Ukrainian crisis. Now, I'm not talking about development projects even in Ukraine itself or in other countries in need. However, Western countries prefer to pump Ukraine with weapons and ammunition, including cluster bombs and depleted uranium weapons. The volume of financial assistance granted by the US and its allies to the global south can in no way be compared to what the West has given over the past 2 years in its war against Russia. For example, Ukraine received 80 billion euros to the whole sum of 165 billion. According to OCHA, at the moment, there are 363 million people who are in serious need of some kind of humanitarian assistance. In order to meet the needs of all country humanitarian plans, $55.5 billion are required, and only 32% of that was received by the end of September. The EU, from February 2022, allocated to Kiev $70 billion, including $37.8 billion as humanitarian and financial assistance. Ukraine received $15 billion for military supplies, and for assisting Ukrainian refugees in the EU, $17 billion. In June 2023, Brussels announced another package of assistance to Ukraine for 2023-2027 to the tune of 50 billion euros. For the peace and security operations in Africa over the past 15 years, the EU has just allocated $4 billion. Expenditure on food security in the region in 2023-24 was 4.5 billion euros. So that's 11 times less than what has been promised to Kiev. In Western financial institutions, Ukraine has also enjoyed a preferential credit regime that can't be compared with what Africa and other regions of the global south receive. The average volume of IMF programs for African countries was in 2023 was 237% of the quotas, but Ukraine, under pressure from IMF shareholders, was 677% of the quotas. The Kyiv assistance program was to the tune of $15.6 billion. It proved in 2023, and it's in more than the 6 months of what the IMF gave to African countries. The IMF and the World Bank has given the Kyiv regime $43 billion, more than half of what was agreed through the Bretton Woods institutions for HIPC countries through the HIPC initiatives. So this is something that was implemented from 1996 and has different mechanisms for debt relief for low-income countries. The scale of the selective humanism, so to speak, of the West is just absolutely astonishing. Really, they've showed their true colours. This imbalance has not gone unnoticed, of course. The president of Mexico, Mr. Obrador, a few days ago said that the U.S., instead of sponsoring the conflict in Ukraine, would be better to pay more attention to eradicating poverty in Latin America. It's good that this is now openly being discussed by different responsible representatives of the humanitarian wing of the UN. The Ukraine is sinking in debt. Its foreign debt, according to the IMF, was more than 88%. This is having an economy rather based solely on the military doesn't lead to growth, and the living standards fall in a country. However, the Zelensky regime nonetheless continues to push its odd narrative about the success in combating corruption. This is despite the fact that when the First Lady of Ukraine visited New York in September, she went into one of the most expensive jewelry stores and spent $1 billion. No doubt this flowed from Ukraine, from the pockets of American and European taxpayers. Such examples of the Ukrainian elite throwing money around abroad is something that's reported on regularly. Given the failure of the Kyiv regime's counter-offensive with the passive and sometimes active support of its Western backers using terrorist methods, now they're trying to strike civilian facilities in Russia. And no bones being made about the fact that Ukrainian saboteurs are being trained, for example, to blow up the Crimean Bridge in October 22. The UK Special Services were involved. London is supplying the Ukrainian army with drones and training saboteurs and providing them with intelligence. This is something that the UK is doing with the US to help the criminal Zelensky regime regime. A few days ago, Kirill Budanov from the Ukrainian intelligence said that the special unit of his country for 3 times tried to seize the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power stations, despite the fact that the head of the IAEA, Mr. Grossi, himself urged Mr. Zelensky not to touch the nuclear power station. I have given you all these facts so that you have a better understanding of the real situation in Ukraine and around it. In order to have a full picture, you need to understand that Russian forces have made significant advances on practically all fronts over the past few days. But unfortunately, the cost of what Ukraine is doing is the mobilization of thousands of new recruits, and most of whom did not want to fight. So over the past 4 months, the Ukrainian regime hasn't been able to do anything about this. Our Western colleagues have, however, decided not to bring an end to this and rather have continued to pump weapons into the country. So we can see that the death throes that this country is in, and the aim of really here is for Ukraine to harm Russia as much as possible. But nobody was threatening Ukraine. What we want is Ukraine living in peace with its neighbors and respecting the rights of all its citizens and with no discrimination. That type of Ukraine used to exist and it will exist, but not under the Zelensky neo-Nazi regime that was, according to Mr. Arestovich, reigning with tyranny, the tyranny of a person who came to power promising peace in the Donbass and a respect for the rights of the Russian-speaking Ukrainians, but rather did the exact opposite. The sooner his Western sponsors understand this, then the better it will be for all those Ukrainians who are still alive. Incidentally, we see that each and every day the so-called values that are supposedly upheld are just being devalued each and every day. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation